Alright, 20.4. Ladies and gentlemen, what are the major water pollution problems affecting oceans? Okay, so, ocean pollution. In developing countries, like we said last section, 80 to 90% of raw sewage is dumped directly into rivers. Where do these rivers go? Where do they end up? They end up in the oceans. And they end up in the coastal areas. Now we have this idea that as soon as we get to the ocean, it's the ocean. Right? But that is not correct. Right? We have the neritic, right? The coastline, right? And that goes to a depth of 500 meters, if you remember, going way back to something we discussed last semester. Right? And then at that point you end up in the open ocean, but then it's broken up into different vertical layers as well. So the ocean takes time to mix, and it takes a lot of time. Luckily for us in Florida, so a lot of the stats that we're going to go over here in a second don't apply to us as much because we have the Gulf Current that comes right around the southern tip of Florida, right? It comes up the east coast, and it helps really churn out that water and cleanse out our coastline. So we're very lucky for that. They don't have that in all countries or other parts of the United States. So what happens is that the water that gets dumped in, the crap that gets dumped into the rivers that then end up in our coastline, or they pollute our coastline for long periods of time. In fact, in California, after a 1-inch rain event, which would be like a heavy rain, it could last an hour and a half, after that they tell the people not to go swimming in the oceans for 72 hours because it's picked up enough pollution and sewage to make the coastline not suitable for human swimming. That's in California. Isn't that crazy? So in China, a majority, so more than 51% of the coastlines can no longer support marine life. That's insane. All right? So China's going through their industrial revolution right now as we speak, and unfortunately they're making a lot of the same environmental mistakes that we have made during our, we were going through our industrial revolution, and hopefully they can change and other countries will change before it's too late. So again, like I said before, the solution to dilution is pollution. We used to believe the ocean could dilute anything, so we dumped industrial toxins, sewage, cruise ship waste. There's a lady dumping the waste right off the cruise ship. Up until about 85 American cruise ships, when they were out in the mid-ocean, they could just they would put all the trash into this one section of the ship, pull a lever, and it would get sucked down to the ocean. Now we still do that with food waste on our cruise ships. We still do that with food, and that's okay. It's biodegradable, and the impact, I'm sure we could find some type of negative impact coming from that, but in general that seems to be okay. But you think about all the other crap that goes on on cruise ships that we're just dumping in the ocean. No bueno. But that's by U.S. laws. Now there's cruise ships that are owned by other countries, and they may not have the same regulations that we have concerning what they can and cannot dump into the ocean. So this leads to stuff like the Pacific Ocean Garbage Patch, where about 80% of the plastic is blown off from waterways, or blown into the ocean from through waterways, streams, rivers. People throw it, they litter, and it gets brought into a river that ends up in the ocean. It gets picked up in these gyres. We have garbage circling all of these, but the biggest one is the Pacific Ocean Garbage Patch, and it is twice the size of the state of Texas, 90 feet deep in the center, and these animals eat it thinking that it's jellyfish, little tiny plankton. So, not good. I got what from the beach? 25% of beachgoers in the U.S. develop ear infections, sore throats, eye irritation, respiratory disease, or gastrointestinal disease from viruses in the sewage that's leaked into the ocean. What? 25% of us are going to get some type of infection because there's poop in the coastline? 1/4 of U.S. coastal areas are too polluted for swimming. 25% of U.S. coastlines are too polluted for swimming. 20% of swimmers develop gonorrhea from the beach. Is that even possible? What? No, it's not. The last stat is fake. Just making sure you were all awake. It's so funny. I know. Ocean eutrophication, right? That's the over-nourishing of the beach, or of the ocean, sorry. Algae blooms, red tides, brown tides, green toxic tides caused by the nitrates and phosphates that run off from sewage and agriculture. So think about the Mississippi River, all that farming along the Mississippi River. All that dumps into the river, all of that eventually flows into, so I'm getting a phone call, that's weird. Alright, all of that flows into the Gulf. Alright, and what happens is there's this huge dead zone in the Gulf. larger. Well, it's about the size of the state of Texas. Everything's the size of the state of Texas. And what happens is the algae, now see if you can put the next pieces in order. The algae grows and does what? It does two things. First, what happens to the sunlight? Think about it. That's right. It blocks the sunlight from reaching the plants in the coastline below. So what happens to the plants there in the coastline? They die. And then there's less dissolved oxygen in the water, right? Now, the algae, as it grows and dies, falls to the bottom of the coast. And what happens to it? That's correct. The bacteria then consume it, right? As the bacteria consume it, they suck out the oxygen in the water. Plus, all of that bacterial activity raises the temperature of the water. Hotter water can hold on to even less oxygen. So basically, because it's very oxygen poor, a zone called blank, because of an H, hypoxia, right? Oxygen poor. And then you develop these dead zones, they call them, and anything that makes it into them will die. Okay. No es bueno. Oil in the sea. The Exxon Valdez, 1989, took 11 million gallons into Prince William Sound in Alaska, killed fish, seabirds, whales. They were coated with oil. The animals, what they do is the birds lose the ability to float, their buoyancy, but they also lose the ability to thermoregulate, right? Because their feathers, which they have their own, usually these water birds have their own oil that they put a sheen on themselves with, and the first layer can stay dry, and then the others stay fluffy and trap air in there, and that air acts as insulation and keeps them warm. While that crude oil just packs everything together, and then their whole body ends up getting wet by this very cold water, and then they get hypothermia and die. Cleanup and settlement costs were $4 billion, paid for by the government because of the way the legislation worked then. Exxon is supposed to pay $5 billion in restitution to the people who lived in that area and fished it for a living. It's 1989, is now 2015, and they have not paid any money because they are a very large company, and they can drag things out and drag things out and drag things out, so they have, right? Knowing that, the rules of the game changed, and then when the BP Gulf spill took place with a lot more oil going into the ocean, the government was ready, and they were able to recoup $20 billion up front from them for claims and for cleanup costs. All right, with another civil lawsuit getting ready, it's pending right now, and it's getting ready to go to trial. So, you know, that's crazy. You know what I mean? Good stuff. Look at this. Look at this. Look at these animals coated in oil. It's terrible. Terrible. Tanker accidents. To try and reduce that, they have two hulls. So that way, if you run aground and you split the first hull, well, the oil isn't up against that bottom hull, right? It's protected by a gap of air, right? There's the one hull, a gap, and then a second hull that holds onto the oil. And then, of course, you know, there's offshore blowouts like the BP, urban and industrial runoff from land. And believe it or not, what contributes the most? 37 to 50% of the oil in the ocean comes from urban and industrial runoff. That's crazy. And it's the worst kind. And I'll tell you that. What do I mean by that? Industrial and urban runoff is usually processed oil, right? So it's thinner, like gasoline, diesel, heating oils, right? They're less viscous than crude oil. So research shows that marine life can recover from crude oil in 3 years because it tends to coagulate, right? Form these balls. We call them tar balls, and they wash up on the beach. If you've ever been on the beach in Florida and you've seen little black balls of tar, or you've stepped in some and got on your foot, that is oil that's spilled into the ocean at some point, and it's coagulated into this ball and it rolls up, or it sinks to the bottom. So it's easier for marine life to deal with that. No es bueno. It's not good though. It's easier to deal with though. The refined stuff is so thin, there's no way it's going to coagulate. Think about the sheen, the beautiful sheens of gasoline when they get in the water. If you've ever filled up a boat on the water, you know what I'm talking about. Or after a rainstorm in the parking lot of a gas station, when that stuff gets in the water, it just spreads. And it's much harder for it to be collected and for us to get rid of it. And therefore, once it spreads thinly, what it can do is wipe out an area of phytoplankton, right, the base of the food chain or food web in the ocean, in a much larger area because it spreads so much farther because it's so thin. So current cleanup methods, we can only recapture about 15% of spilled oil, and that's crude oil. The thin oil, basically none. All right, so most non-point pollution comes from agricultural runoff, so we can do a better job of going back to food and soil, doing a better job of keeping onto the sediments. Do you remember the contour and strip planting? Right, if you have a slope, don't plant parallel with the slope, plant perpendicular, right, and that will help slow down the movement of sediment off of the agricultural lands. Do strip cropping, right? So you have one layer when you're waiting to harvest one thing, or you've just harvested it, right? You've got another layer right below that of things that are still growing that helps trap and absorb the nutrients, the sediment, so it doesn't wash away. Keep fields covered with vegetation to prevent soil erosion, reduce fertilizer use, organic farming, buffer zones. Boom, you get it, you get it. This slide we already saw last presentation. The Clean Water Act, if you remember, regulates the discharge of pollutants by companies, right? Safe Drinking Water Act establishes maximum contaminant levels for things in our drinking water. And the National Resource Defense Council is trying to push to ban the lead that is in all of our faucets and fixtures. So again, Clean Water Act, discharges. Safe Drinking Water Act, drinking water, the maximum contaminant levels. And then Water Quality Act controls pollution of surface waters. Okay, so these would be your lakes, ponds. Okay, this does usually flowing bodies of water, streams, rivers, or that empty into the ocean. These deal with more of your lakes, ponds, your lentic bodies of water. And that is 12.4, right? Excellent.